till the end.
What happened to her? Welcome everybody. If you should be able to hear me now, and you might just want to give a thumbs up sign if all is well. You've been listening to the Illogical Spoon, headed up by our friend Jeremy Segrist from Michigan, in a song that was inspired by some of the themes of this webinar. Thank you very much for signing on and joining in. I know we've got a couple of people trying to tune in by smartphones. We've got at least one pub in the mix in Portland. We've got the Elkhart crew online, and so a number of our regulars, and also a number of new people who I believe are, this is their first webinar, so particular welcome to you. At the console helping out tonight is Charlita Erb and Tim Nofziger, and so as you can see in the notes, particularly at the bottom of the chat box now, you see the numbers. If you need help, you can call them. As far as protocols go, same as usual. You see the chat box on the right middle of your screen. You're welcome to chat thoughts. We appreciate no cross-chatting while we're doing the presentation. And then Tim and Charlita are going to work to see if we can get a couple of you on after the presentation to do some responses. In the meantime, however, don't try to fiddle with your microphone or your video. We will do that from our end. So again, thanks for joining us. I want to begin tonight with an old story from Scripture that really succinctly poses the dilemma that we're going to be looking at tonight. It's a version of the story of the manna in the wilderness. It's the minority version that we find in Numbers 11. You know the story. God feeds the people of Israel right after they've been liberated from slavery in Egypt. The punchline of the story in Numbers, however, is that as the people gather the gift, they begin to compulsively over-consume it, and they're unable to stop eating. So they die of a plague of too much at a place that this old Hebrew story calls Kibroth Hatava, or the graves of greed. As many of you know, I think this ancient tale is a parable that speaks to our condition, as the Quakers say. It deals with the human inability to set limits on our appetites and the resulting destruction not only to our communities but also to the environment. It's an old wisdom, and as I said, I think it succinctly names the dilemma. And the dilemma is simply this. This is not news to any of you, but it's a way of framing the purpose for this particular theme of the webinar tonight. And that is, we are obviously in a critical ecological moment in the history of the Earth. The 2004 Living Planet report calculated an aggregate global ecological footprint, indicating that human activities have been in an overshoot position for now about 3 decades, since 1986. And of course, we continue to increase our footprint each year. What this means is that the global population's actual use of the Earth's bioproductive capacity is now in more than a 20% overshoot of what's actually available. We are, in other words, rapidly liquidating nature, and this is ecologically unsustainable. And put another way, or calculated another way, each year we deepen our debt to the Earth. Earth Overshoot Day was inaugurated some years ago to mark the day each year, each calendar year, when humanity begins living beyond its ecological means. After this day, which in the last year was, I I think sometime in September. After this day, we move into the ecological equivalent of deficit spending, utilizing resources at a rate faster than the planet can regenerate in a year. Globally, as you know, we now require 1.5 planets to support our aggregate lifestyles. So the upshot of all of that is that we are in what Derek Jensen rightly calls an end game, marching relentlessly toward those graves of greed that were spoken by that ancient story. James Spate is a long-time mainstream environmental policy leader, and in 2008 he published what I think is one of the most straightforward, sobering accounts of where we are. How serious is the threat to the environment? Here is one measure. All we have to do to destroy the planet's climate and biota and leave a ruined world to our children is to keep doing exactly what we are doing, with no growth in the human population or world economy. Just continue to release the greenhouse gases, impoverish the ecosystems, release the toxic chemicals, and the world in the latter part of the century will not be fit to live in. Spate concludes that we are actually facing an enormous increase in environmental deterioration at present, right when we need to be moving strongly in the opposite direction. I just want to name one other resource that you might not be familiar with. This book just came out. It's by Michael Clare, who for, well, really my entire adult life has been one of the reliable analysts of the macro, social, political, and economic issues. And his newest book is called The Race for What's Left, The Global Scramble for the World's Last Resources. And he talks about the fact that over the last 150 years, industrial civilization has pretty much harvested all the low-hanging fruit in terms of extractive resources on the planet, and now our extractive habits are getting more extreme, more predatory, more brutal, not only to the earth, but also in terms of human rights. And these are just a few ways to characterize the crisis that we're in. A good, or rather an awful, example of what Clare means here is the tar sands extraction in northern Alberta, Canada. The once lush, vast, and magnificent boreal forests have been turned into a barren industrial landscape of open pit mines and toxic tailing ponds in a desperate attempt to extract oil, driven by this lust for profit and our collective addiction to fossil fuels. This tar sands extraction is giving us a dramatic preview of the ecological graves of greed. That's why environmentalist Bill Mckibben, who was actually one of the very first people to sound the alarm around global warming back in the 1980s, Mckibben believes that the carbon that would be released into the atmosphere if we consume the tar sands oil would essentially push us past the point of no return. And his 350.org, symbolizing the parts per million of toxins in the atmosphere, his 350.org group is therefore opposing not just the tar sands extraction, but also the Keystone XL pipeline project through the United States and the Northern Gateway pipeline through Canada that is part of that project to get that oil to market. And this is an issue that several of you on this phone call are aware of and involved in. We think this is a very important campaign that we support. So that's a little bit of an overview of the ecological dilemma. Of course, it's also a social dilemma because the greed driving these environmentally disastrous schemes is unequally spread across the globe. We in the United States have by far the largest ecological footprint, and those of us who are economically privileged within our society, we have the largest footprint of all. So there are both issues of fundamental justice as well as sustainability. We're not only robbing the earth, we are robbing the poor. This is a map from Al Gore's famous global warming project, which shows how unevenly distributed the per capita responsibility for CO2 emission into the atmosphere is around the globe. The red countries have a much higher share of the CO2 emissions. So all of this reminds us of the historical moment that we are in. And it is the context for this talk. This crisis has many dimensions, not least of which is theological for our communities of faith. And it's in light of the crisis that I began work about 8 years ago on the project that eventually became this webinar. It began actually as an invitation from Ruby Sales to give a talk for Earth Day in Washington, D.C. in 2005, sponsored by Spirit House, an African-American organizing collective headed by Ruby. Ruby is very famous as a civil rights legend and continues to work on a variety of issues. I was particularly taken with this effort by this inner-city African-American organization to look at issues of eco-justice. So this talk was originally crafted for this opportunity 7.5 years ago, and I've been working periodically on it since then. I published a chapter in 2007, and if you look up at the notes section of your screen, you'll see the URL where you can download that free article that sort of summarizes the gist of this talk. As I said, that was published in 2007. Last week I presented this talk to the Ecological Hermeneutics section of the Society for Biblical Literature in Chicago. So it's an ongoing project. It's one that's very dear to my heart, and we're really happy to present it tonight to you. So to the task at hand, I want to begin with another ancient lament from the Bible, this time from the prophet Jeremiah, who counseled people of faith to take up weeping and wailing for the mountains, lamentation for the wilderness, because they are laid waste, so that no one passes through. Both the birds of the air and the animals have fled and are gone. So this lament obviously brings up the question what our faith communities are doing about this crisis. And as you know, there's a huge culture war right now in North America concerning attitudes toward the environmental crisis. We saw this yet again on display in the last elections. It's certainly also very evident in Canada with the administration there. And of course, one of the most important fronts in this culture war involves our churches and our faith communities. Will we take will we stand by and watch the destruction of the planet, or will we take the lead in protecting what's left? Now, theological and political conservatives have tended to think that the creation was given by God to human beings to exploit without limit, and they use the Bible to justify that position. Now, this is a view that, while all of us on this call would reject out of hand, it's a view that has been enormously influential since the Reagan era. The famous "a tree's a tree" attitude was first attributed to Reagan in 1966 when he was governor of California. But it still prevails in many places in our society, and particularly on the political and religious right. As we all know, there are many religious groups, church groups, who believe that because the world is coming to an end anyway, we might as well use up the resources. There are still far too many North American churchgoers who support unrestrained resource exploitation. This kind of bad theology remains a huge barrier to the wake-up call that we need to be about. So in light of this social, political, ecological, and theological crisis that we're facing, I want to focus tonight on the question of whether the Bible actually does support a theology of selfishness, or whether it seeks to animate practices of earth care and sustainable stewardship. Now, to do this, that's a huge topic, So to do this, I want to take just one representative example as a lens to try to get a handle on this. And why not take a cue from former President Reagan and focus on trees? In contrast, however, to Ronald Reagan, the Hebrew prophet Isaiah wrote, "Like the days of a tree shall my people be." Now, I believe that this ancient prophetic consciousness suggests an almost essential symbiosis between human culture and the forests. In most indigenous cultures, the oldest and largest trees in the area were revered as the spiritual and social heart of the camp. These trees offered witness to the past, shelter in the present, and continuity with the future. Here in California, the sacred tree is the majestic redwood in the north and the beautiful live oak in the south, pictured here. Elsewhere, in different bioregions, it's a different tree, but there is always a sacred tree, under which elders would gather in order to adjudicate community life, resolve conflicts, offer spiritual counsel, tell sacred stories to help the people remember who they were. Local variants on this tradition of the wisdom tree can be found from Celtic Britain to the origins of Buddhism under the Bodhi Tree, and from native California to biblical Lebanon. Here are just a couple of the books that are available if you're interested in studying more about this cultural phenomenon that really is as old as humanity. Indeed, these ancient ways have survived until relatively recently. For example, Elaine, my wife, grew up hearing tales from her grandparents about Die Alte Eiche, and I'll bet you, Hedy Zawatsky there in Niagara, you remember these stories too. The old oak in their Mennonite villages in the Ukraine. Similarly, today in California, there are plaques commemorating historic oaks under which important treaties were signed or the first Catholic masses were said. Although sacred trees are no longer acknowledged as the center of our Western consciousness or communities, they still are the living heart of the land, but only if we have eyes to see. Now, to some, probably not to those of you on this call, but certainly to some in our churches and many of our own friends and family, this kind of thing sounds a little New Agey. So it's important that in this theological struggle, it's important that we recognize and affirm that our scriptures know all about this tradition. Unlike our modern culture, the worldview reflected in the Bible reflects a sense of rootedness in place, of relationship with the natural world. We meet the first great hero in the biblical narrative of redemption in Genesis 12. Abram is called by God out of the imperial city of Haran to journey to the margins of Canaan, and there he encounters Yahweh under an oak. Now the name of the oak is Elon Moreh, and rabbinic scholars write that this means teacher or oracle giver. In other words, this was not just a sacred tree, it was a teaching tree. Again, you get the notion here that was so common in antiquity of the tree of life, sort of a cosmic axis mundi, unifying heaven and earth. It's a bridge between the human and divine spheres, and hence an ideal medium for revelation. It is here under this sacred tree that Abram pitches his nomad's tents, and here he builds the very first altar in the Bible. Now this primal scenario would be only interesting were it not for the fact that the same thing happens repeatedly throughout the ensuing chapters of the Abraham cycle. In Genesis 13, we're told that Abram moved his tents and went to live near the great trees of Mamre at Hebron. Apparently the Alone Mamre was another sacred grove, and here Abraham builds another altar to the Lord and meets God there in multiple visions in Genesis 15 and again in Genesis 18. This latter text is particularly noteworthy. Rabbi Arthur Waskow points out that the Hebrew makes it clear that God appeared not above the tree, but in the tree, literally in the branches. And Abraham looks up and sees the three celestial beings in the branches of the tree. Clearly, the oaks of Mamre were a sacred grove, affirmed by the fact that Abraham later purchases the grove, is buried there. Later on, Isaac lives there. Jacob is buried there. It's very, very important to the history of the earliest Yahwists. Nor are these scenarios exceptional. Abraham planted a tree at Beersheba, we are told in Genesis 21, and there invoked the name of the Lord. The Israelite heroes Gideon and Elijah both had divine encounters beneath the shade of oaks. So clearly, the Israelite community was one that was closely associated with a landscape and a habitat that was understood to be a medium for divine communion and revelation. These kinds of narratives should establish beyond doubt that Israel was a people of place. And not only in the beginning of the Bible, but all the way at the very end of our canon, the tree of life springs up out of the middle of the New Jerusalem, and the leaves of that tree are for the healing of the nations. So from beginning to end, the Bible acknowledges the role of the sacred tree in the people's journey of liberation. That's why I want to talk about trees tonight. Because in some sense, the healing of both our earth and our peoples depends upon our recovery of a relationship with the forests. But I don't mean this in some sort of fuzzy New Age sense. I want to talk about the long struggle in human history between those who see the intrinsic value and spiritual character of trees and those who exploit old-growth forests for economic and political gain, destroying in the process our treasured commonwealth. Now, friends, it turns out that this is the oldest struggle in civilization, and of course, tragically, as contemporary as today's newspaper. So, let's dive in. To really see the roots of this issue, I want to take the case of the most sacred tree in the Bible, the famous Cedars of Lebanon. The French poet Alphonse de Lamartine wrote, "The cedars know the history of the earth better than history itself." Like so many other Europeans in early modernity, Lamartine was fascinated by the magnificent cedars of Lebanon, their majesty, their beauty at high altitudes, their formidable role in the annals of the peoples of the Levant. Lamartine's remarkable assertion can serve as a trope for these reflections, because I'm going to contend that this most ancient of sacred trees stands as a sort of sentinel, a witness to possibly the first instance of human-engineered environmental destruction in the history of the world. But first, a reality check. This is a picture of Dorothy Stang. She could be your grandmother. She was a Notre Dame sister from Dayton, Ohio, and a missionary in Brazil. She was a faith leader, educator, lobbyist, farm advisor, and political analyst on behalf of the rural poor in Brazil. She was particularly involved on behalf of land reform practices encouraged by the church that challenged governmental policies. Sister Dorothy was working on the pilot program to conserve the Brazilian rainforest, a project that was promoting environmental control to reduce deforestation and bolstering the economy by encouraging sustainable activities among poor campesino communities. "This is a hopeful project for the Amazon," she wrote, "but we are plagued by logging companies and ranchers who are destroying thousands of acres each year here in our area." In mid-February of 2005, this 73-year-old nun was murdered by ranchers near Anapu, Brazil, because of her attempts to halt the illegal logging. of virgin rainforest. Stang was walking to a meeting with local community groups when she was confronted by her assassins. Witnesses said she pulled a Bible from her bag and began reading a passage to them. They listened for a moment and then shot her point blank 6 times, killing her instantly. I wonder what text she was reading. But Dorothy hasn't been the only one. In October 1991, Father Nerolito Satur was murdered in his parish in the Philippines. The young priest was ambushed by armed men because of his opposition to illegal logging in that area. Just days before his murder, he had confiscated truckloads of timber being brought down to lowland buyers. As a deputized forest officer, Satur, together with other priests and local citizens, had intercepted several trucks bearing illegally cut trees, and he was working for the arrest of the responsible loggers. In 1907, the Philippines had a rainforest cover of 70% of its land area. By 1992, it was down to 8%. Nerolito Satur was one of 10 priests to be murdered for such activity in the late 1980s and early 1990s. Perhaps more known to you is the great forest martyr Chico Mendes. Born in 1944, he grew up in a family of traditional rubber tappers. For the cattle ranchers and mining interests in Brazil, this traditional form of sustainable agriculture was impeding profit-making. Far more money could be made by tearing down the forest as fast as possible and replacing it with pasture land and strip mines. So Mendes encountered a great deal of opposition from industrialists and corrupt government officials opposed to his organizing among rubber tappers. He was jailed, fined, and threatened, but persisted until 1988, when he too was murdered. These events and the grassroots movement of nonviolent protest they inspired have been chronicled by Andrew Revkin in his 2004 book, Burning Season, The Murder of Chico Mendes and the Fight for the Amazon Rainforest. These forest martyrs remind us that the destruction of the world's forests are a major concern of our age. According to the United Nations, 40% of Central America's forests were destroyed between 1950 and 1980. During the same period, Africa lost a quarter of its forests. Half of the world's forests have been cut down, most of them in the last 50 years. With deforestation comes a whole range of environmental problems, among them severe flooding, accelerated loss of topsoil, encroaching desertification, and declining soil productivity. Dorothy Stang, Nerolito Satur, and Chico Mendes remind us that to talk about saving trees is not about feel-good tree hugging, but rather about the ongoing life and death struggle between sustainable communities who are reliant upon the forests and the powerful economic and political interests that pillage them. We often imagine that this environmental issue is only contemporary, but the truth is, it's the oldest story in history. The most famous forests of the ancient Near East were found in Lebanon, a region whose name comes from the Semitic root elbab, meaning the white mountain because of its snowy covering. These highlands were once blanketed with hardwood cedar forests, often referred to in antiquity as simply the glory of Lebanon. These magnificent trees, Cedars libani, average a height of more than 100 feet, 4 stories tall. They're 50 feet in girth, many with an age of more than 1,000 years. Interestingly, the Hebrew word for cedar, eres, is nearly homonymous with the Hebrew word for earth, eretz. Both are feminine. This leads me to suspect that there was an ancient correlation among the early Israelites between Mother Earth and Grandmother Cedar. These trees were held in great reverence The psalmist reflects on the special status the cedars held as trees of the Lord. This verse in Psalm 104 celebrates how these highland trees are watered abundantly, that their canopies represent an ecosystem that offers shelter to other creatures. We don't often acknowledge what keen observers biblical people were, with deep understandings of the intricate relationships of the web of life. Charlene, there are people trying to get in. The cedar represents the most common nature image in the Hebrew Bible, and appears as a key metaphor that was used in a variety of ways in the Bible, as you see just a couple of examples here. Cedars symbolize ultimate value. The righteous person is like a cedar, or the beloved. Israel as a nation, too, is compared to the cedar. Note the multiple references to the fragrance of Lebanon in this text from Hosea, reminding us of how sensate these ancient people were. Admittedly, when we think of the Middle East today, we don't think of luxuriant forests. Anyone who has visited Israel or Palestine will find it hard to believe that once vast tracts of timber grew throughout that now relatively barren region. Yet at the start of the third millennium before the Common Era, the mountain slopes of the Levant were covered with massive cedar forests. But these forests had almost entirely disappeared by the time of Jesus of Nazareth. And today, the denuded highlands of Lebanon bear testimony to ancient environmental destruction. It seems that the cedars in antiquity were to the Mediterranean cultures what the sequoia redwoods were to 19th century Americans coming to California. That is to say, on the one hand, they were revered, on the other hand, mercilessly exploited. The cedars were the subject of countless literary and artistic paeans in antiquity, but they were also the primary resource used in the construction of temples and palaces in the kingdoms of the Fertile Crescent. The rulers of these empires undertook massive building programs to display their power and wealth, as we will see. In the early modern period, the cedars fascinated European travelers to the Holy Land. After all, Europe had long been deforested, so these travelers had little experience of the huge trees. One travel essay from the 19th century attempted to catalog the number of cedars remaining at a Lebanese village called, ironically, Eden, using various recorded accounts of travelers to that area between 1550 and 1818. In 1997, a scientist, David Haslam, in forestry science, collated this anecdotal data into a table, plotted it onto a regression line, fitted into an exponential decay curve, and using a best fit trend line, extrapolated backwards to the time of the kingdom of ancient Israel. His extrapolations suggest that there may have been as many as 1 million cedar trees at the time that Solomon's temple was built. Today, however, less than 6% of Lebanon remains forested, with cedars comprising less than 3% of that area. There remain only 12 stands, consisting of about 1,700 hectares, a reduction of 97% of what once existed. In other words, friends, we can literally count the number of cedars that remain. The most famous stand is named Ars al-Rab, Cedars of the Lord. It's about 80 miles from Beirut, near the birthplace of the great Lebanese poet Khalil Gibran. There are about 375 cedars, some over 2,000 years old, that have survived in a sheltered glacial pocket of Mount Mckibben at an altitude of 5,000 feet. This small surviving grove bears silent witness to ecological destruction that began some 5,000 years ago. This is a legacy that is alluded to surprisingly often by the Hebrew prophets, as we'll shortly see. But the story is older than the Bible. Indeed, the tale of the destruction of the cedar forests of the Middle East is told in the oldest known literature in the world, the Epic of Gilgamesh. Written in Mesopotamia sometime in the 3rd millennium before the Common Era, this epic concerns King Gilgamesh, whose name in fact appears on Mesopotamian king lists from 2800 BCE. An Assyrian version of the tale is found in the library of Ashurbanipal from the 7th century before the Common Era, probably dating back to 1700 BCE. Smaller Sumerian fragments with just a few hundred lines are dated around 2000 BCE. All of this indicates that the Epic of Gilgamesh was known for more than 15 centuries before Homer and circulated widely throughout a large region of the ancient Middle East. The second episode of the epic is known as the Forest Journey. It narrates the desire of Gilgamesh, the ruler of the city-state Uruk, to aggrandize himself with a name that endures by building great walls and ramparts and temples. For this, of course, Gilgamesh needs timber. So the king and his companion Enkidu set out for the land where the cedar is felled. Now, the cedar forests were considered to be the garden of the gods, and they were protected by the chief Sumerian deity Enlil, who entrusted the ferocious demigod Humbaba to guard the forests against the encroachment of civilization. Gilgamesh and Enkidu cross 7 mountain ranges, how archetypal, in search of the cedar. And when they arrive, initially they're stunned into reverent silence. They stood quite still, we're told, and looked at the forest. They saw how high were the great cedars, gazed upon the entrance to the forest. They saw the cedar mountain where the gods lived. The cedar raised aloft its great luxuriant growth. What cool shade, they said to each other. What delight. But their awe didn't last long, for we next read that Gilgamesh gripped his axe and began felling the cedar. Humbaba, hearing the sound of this, fell into a fury. "Who is it who has come to interfere with my trees?" he raged. Gilgamesh begins to chop at the cedars, while Enkidu lops off their branches. Then Humbaba begins to react, and a great struggle ensues. But at the end of the struggle, Gilgamesh takes the axe and strikes not a tree, but the neck of Humbaba. And the epic tells us, for 2 leagues the cedars resounded. There followed great confusion. This was the guardian of the forest whom they had struck to the ground. He at whose words Hermon and Lebanon trembled. You might recognize that phrase from the Psalms. Now the mountains were moved, for the guardian of the cedar lay dead. When Enlil learns of the destruction of the cedar forests, he sends down a series of ecological curses on the offenders. May the food you eat be eaten by fire. May the water you drink be drunk by fire. Now, the Gilgamesh myth functions primarily to legitimize the king's heroic quest for immortality, but at several points, and particularly here, the epic seems to preserve a certain pre-imperial anxiety over the way in which civilization does not recognize its limits. There's an overall sense that once humans start exploiting the forests, nothing will stop them. And indeed, the Forest Journey chapter concludes with this chilling note. So Gilgamesh felled the trees of the forest, and Enkidu cleared their roots as far as the banks of the Euphrates. Now that's clear cutting. We know, in fact, from the actual historic practices of successive Mesopotamian kingdoms, that deforestation figured prominently in their decline. In fact, this has been most recently analyzed by Jared Diamond's 2004 book, Collapse. The Euphrates, Tigris, and Karen rivers and tributaries began to fill with silt, clogging up their irrigation canals. Deforestation also exposed the salt-rich sedimentary rocks of the northern mountains to erosion. After 1,500 years of successful farming, a serious salinity problem suddenly developed. Declining food production resulted, signaling the beginning of the end for Sumerian civilization. What a lesson! The very grandiose building schemes that sought to strengthen the myth of empire ended up bringing on its destruction. The archetypal struggle between Gilgamesh and Humbaba narrates, I think, a lesson about the human conquest of nature. This war against the forest and against cultures that live symbiotically with nature has been repeated in every generation since Gilgamesh, in every corner of the globe, to satisfy our ever-increasing appetite for material growth. This is the oldest conflict on the planet, and it continues today. But now, of course, it's not just forests. It's rivers, aquifers, mountains, tundra, the ozone layer, even our own genetic makeup. Countless endangered or extinct species are the toll in this war. But in destroying nature, we are in fact cannibalizing our very life source, just like the Sumerians did. Or as Evan Eisenberg in his brilliant book, The Ecology of Eden, puts it, civilization depends on wilderness. The inverse, however, does not apply. So our generation, is just beginning to realize that this is an end game. It has become the central challenge to our time. But there's lots to learn from the deep history of this crisis. So, a little more context. The cedar forests of Lebanon were prized as a strategic economic asset in antiquity. They were repeatedly the target of imperial conquests. Most of the lowland areas of the Mediterranean and the Fertile Crescent had already been logged out by the time of the earliest city-states. So the tall stands of hardwood in the Lebanon were coveted for their size and durability. Cedar wood resists rot and insects. It's aromatic. It polishes well. It has a close, straight grain which makes it good to work with. The Egyptians used cedar sawdust for mummification and the resin known as cedria for embalming. It also has medicinal uses. In 1954, archaeologists found the Tomb of Cheops at Khufu in the famous Giza Pyramid. Underneath it was the funeral barge of Pharaoh Khufu, who lived around 2500 BCE. It was made of Lebanese cedar wood. And more than 4,000 years later, the faint scent of cedar was still in the grain at the time of its discovery. It was the Phoenicians who first used the cedars to build the world's first great maritime nation. They used the wood to build their famous seagoing boats from which they ruled the coast of present-day Lebanon, from such ancient cities as Byblos, Tyre, and Sidon. Moreover, they came to control the lucrative international cedar market. As far back as 2800 BCE, the people of Byblos were cutting down cedar trees in the mountains of Lebanon to ship to Egypt and Mesopotamia. In return, the Phoenicians brought back gold, copper, and turquoise. The biblical prophet Ezekiel writes at great length about the Phoenician city-state of Tyre and its insatiable hunger for lumber. For example, in Ezekiel 27, you see this oracle talking about how they made all your planks of fir trees. They took a cedar from Lebanon to make the masts of your ships. Ezekiel's elaborate taunt against imperial Tyre was, of course, the model for the political prisoner John of Patmos, who expropriated this same oracle in his apocalyptic critique of Rome's oppressive international political economy that we find in Revelation 18. The Phoenicians traded cedar to Egypt until the pharaohs conquered Lebanon and gained direct access to the forests. Later, the Babylonians asserted control over the cedars and used them to build their fabled city. In the 6th century BCE, Persian control of Phoenician ports gave them the means to assemble a navy for use against the Greeks. And then the Greeks, and then the Roman empires, all expanded into Syria and the Lebanon, continuing the pattern of exploitation. The highlands of Lebanon were so denuded by the time of the Roman Emperor Hadrian that he felt obliged to install markers around the few remaining trees and to declare them an imperial domain. Some of these markers can still be seen in museum collections. It was the first national forest. However, periodic exploitation of the cedars continued for another 2 millennia. The last clear-cutting was done by the Ottoman Turks, who took all the cedar growing within the transport distance of the Hijaz Railway to provide fuel for their wood-burning engines. Only the highest and most remote groves escaped damage. From antiquity to the present, then, the pattern was always the same. Imperial powers saw the cedars of Lebanon as a strategic objective and sent their armies to secure access to these trees. As Benjamin Kassoff put it in his comprehensive study of this history, the forests of Lebanon were under a constant state of siege. No wonder then that the prophet Jeremiah warned his nation's leaders that the nearby forests were as much in danger from the surrounding powers as was Israel herself. Given this background, it's not surprising, I suppose, that Israel's own short-lived experiment with regional hegemony under King Solomon was, like that of old Gilgamesh, characterized by a lust after cedar hardwood. When King David conquered Jerusalem, King Hiram of Tyre approaches him with a gift of cedar trees and carpenters and masons who built David a house. Interestingly, it's only upon receiving this gift of imperial prestige, the narrator tells us, that David perceived that the Lord had established him as king over Israel. Of course, David was unable to consummate the temple building project. That fell to Solomon. And upon hearing of Solomon's ascension to the throne, once again Hiram came knocking, ever at the service of royal building ambitions. 1 Kings 5 records in some detail how Hiram supplied cedar to build the first great temple and palace in Jerusalem. The description there of Hiram's scheme to bring the logs down to the sea from the Lebanon and float them south by seagoing rafts and then haul them back up to Jerusalem happens to be quite historically accurate, because we see this process imaged on a frieze depicting the transportation of timber, a frieze that comes from the palace of King Sargon II in the 8th century BCE, right around the time of the Deuteronomist. This earliest Assyrian bas-relief to be discovered in the West depicts the process of logging and then taking the logs down by the sea. Well, Solomon's treaty with Hiram was a sweet deal between royal houses, food in exchange for luxury imports. All the logging, meantime, was done by conscripted labor, says 1 Kings 5. This is not so unlike the political economy of bananas or coffee or zinc or uranium or palm oil today. The labor of poorly paid farmers and miners catering to a market controlled by highly paid profiteers at an enormous and unaccounted environmental cost to the land itself. We might say, therefore, that there was blood on the cedar that figured so prominently in Solomon's temple, not to mention in his own royal house, called ironically enough, with great imperial hubris, the house of the forest of Lebanon, lined with cedar from floor to ceiling. We have extended descriptions in 1 Kings 6. In other words, the cedar trade was one of the many ways in which Solomon aped the habits of other ancient dynasties. And it was precisely these sorts of royal patterns of apostasy that earned the Israelite monarchy the scorn of the prophets, who viewed them as the reason why the monarchy was doomed. Because of these economic and political patterns, the prophets often used the image of the cedar of Lebanon as a metaphor for empire itself. For example, Amos's Yahweh boasts, "I destroyed the Amorite before them, whose height was like the height of cedars. I destroyed his fruit above and his roots beneath." Or, for example, Zechariah, "Open your doors, O Lebanon, so that fire may devour your cedars. Wail, O cypress, for the cedar has fallen. The thick forest has been felled." This rhetorical tradition is most fully developed in Ezekiel 31, which is an elaborate allegory in which the Assyrian Empire is similarly figured as a towering cedar dominating the landscape. Interestingly, like Ezekiel 27, Ezekiel 31 is also echoed in the New Testament in Jesus' famous mustard seed parable in Mark 4. The punchline of Ezekiel's oracle is that Yahweh is going to do a little clear cutting of his own. This is a classic judgment image in which empire succumbs to its own logic. Foreigners have come and cut it down and left it. Right? So empire is like a cedar, but God cuts down the cedar. But notice in the last part of this oracle, we're told that on the mountains and in the valleys its branches has fallen, its boughs lie broken in the watercourses, and all the peoples of the earth have gone away from its shade and left it. And yet Ezekiel goes on to say, but all the birds of the air have re-inhabited this composting tree. It's very interesting that the prophets, keen observers of nature, understood the natural life cycle of a forest from towering tree to composting log, and using this reasoning looks forward to the demise of the Assyrian Empire. Meanwhile, the reference in Ezekiel's oracle to the great height of the Assyrian Empire is a clear allusion to the oldest tale in the Bible, the story of Babel's Tower in Genesis 11. "Come, let us build a city with its top in the heavens. Let us make a name for ourselves." This tale, of course, is a thinly veiled parody of the Mesopotamian ziggurats, the architectural symbol of ancient Near Eastern empire. So Ezekiel 31 truly is one of the most amazing anti-imperial oracles in our scriptural tradition. This same connection is also made in Isaiah 2. "The Lord of hosts has a day against all that is proud and lofty, against all that is lifted up, against all the cedars of Lebanon, lofty and lifted up," Isaiah warns. But then he immediately decodes his metaphor. "I'm talking about every high tower, every fortified wall, against all the ships of Tarshish and their beautiful craft." You see, the prophets longed for the day when the great powers would, in the justice of Yahweh, themselves be cut down, just like the cedars they exploited. And that brings us to really the last great text I want to look at. And it was a text that I really puzzled over the first time I encountered it. It comes from 1 Isaiah. Now, Isaiah can be dated fairly accurately because of all the historical markers throughout the text. For example, we know that Sennacherib became the king of Assyria and made Nineveh his capital in the year 704 before the Common Era. And we know that in 701 he defeated Pharaoh and in 689 destroyed Babylon. And in fact, we have, as you see here, a frieze that describes Sennacherib's invasion of Judah, and about how basically he hammered King Hezekiah. So we know this historic moment from extra-biblical sources, but in Isaiah 37, we get the prophet's point of view on the crisis. And the crisis is the Israelite King Hezekiah is trying to negotiate new alliances in the wake of these imperial power shifts. This is just before Sennacherib defeats Israel. And the prophet is warning Hezekiah not to seek political and military security in an alliance with the Assyrian king. And so he depicts Assyria as a royal consort who's looking down her nose at Israel. She despises you, she scorns you, she tosses her head behind your back. Isaiah is trying to make the point that Israel is a small fish, and no great imperial king is going to really negotiate with Israel. But then the oracle shifts, and Yahweh, according to Isaiah, takes personal umbrage at Sennacherib's boasting. Who have you mocked and reviled? Against whom have you raised your voice and lifted your eyes? See how he's reversing the metaphor. Against the Holy One of Israel. By your servants you have mocked the Lord. Now what is mockery of the king of Assyria? I have with my many chariots gone up the heights of the mountains to the far recesses of the Lebanon. I felled its tallest cedars. I came to its remotest height, its densest forests. Now, the thing that puzzled me about this oracle is I couldn't figure out what chariots were doing in the deep forest. Chariots are instruments of war, and not logging. And yet, I realized after researching the political economy of Cedar that this oracle unmasks the fact that the cedar groves were being militarily secured as strategic objectives, just as were the oil fields in both recent Gulf wars. Driving chariots up Mount Lebanon, I suppose, was a bit like driving heavy tanks through Iraqi swamps. Very difficult, but the imperial or corporate will to conquer did eventually prevail. This reminds us that still today our wars are ultimately resource wars, as is certainly the case in the continuing war in Afghanistan. Little wonder then that Isaiah, in an earlier passage, envisions the end of empire as relief not only for oppressed people, but also for the forests. In Isaiah 14, we find this absolutely stunning poetry. When Yahweh has given you rest from your pain and turmoil and from the hard service with which you were made to serve, take up this taunt against the king of Babylon. My, how the oppressor has ceased, how his insolence has ceased. The Lord has broken the staff of the wicked, the scepter of rulers, that struck down the peoples in wrath with unceasing blows, that ruled the nations in anger with unrelenting persecution. Isaiah's metaphor portrays the emperor of Babylon with his symbolic staff or scepter, using it like a raging cop with a nightstick beating on people. But the God of justice breaks that baton. And then, peace. There follows a moment of cosmic Quaker silence. And then, do you hear it? The earth starts chanting. The trees are singing. And what are they saying? Since you were laid low, no one comes to cut us down. This was the phrase that some of you heard at the introductory music by the Illogical Spoon, a chant that they've taken up from this verse, and a chant that our friend Jay Beck loves to use. What an extraordinary image. Trees celebrating the downfall of kings who brutally logged them. What an amazing hymn to environmental justice. And it's right in our Bible, who so many people, Christians included, think has nothing to say about our ecological crisis or about creation care. Just a footnote. The biblical prophets not only diagnosed the problem, they also held on to hope in terms of a vision of Yahweh's renewal of the earth. And it's extremely significant that these visions of renewal portray the land restored through reforestation. Isaiah 35 is a good case in point. The wilderness and the dry land shall be glad. The desert shall rejoice and blossom. The glory of Lebanon, aka the Cedars, shall be returned to the desert. The majesty of Carmel and Sharon. All will see the glory of the Lord. This is specifically talking about the ecological hope of reforestation. Well, now that's interesting. Is it possible that the prophets understood that the land of Palestine had not always been a desert, that it had not always been barren? Did they understand that actually their landscapes, so dry and treeless, were in fact the product of ancient desertification resulting from imperial clear-cutting? Ultimately, their oracles of judgment are hymns of hope, looking for salvation as nature restored. The Kadisha Valley in Lebanon has been the site of monastic communities continuously since the earliest days of Christianity. Early on, these communities claimed the role of guardians of the cedar forests, just like Humbaba of old. Thanks to these old monks and to modern environmentalists, the last remaining stands of cedar in the Lebanon were inscribed as a UNESCO World Historic Site in 1998. The fact that the cedars of Lebanon still survive today, though in vastly reduced numbers, is a reminder to us both of the fragility but also of the endurance of the creation, and of the duty of people of faith and conscience to pay attention. And this brings us back to our own time and the question of what this tradition of fierce prophetic eco-justice might mean for us. In the late 1990s, Julia Butterfly Hill lived for 2 years high in the canopy of a Northern California redwood to prevent logging of old-growth stands, and in so doing spearheaded a new tradition of nonviolent resistance to environmental degradation. Some years later, the cause was taken up by John Quigley, a middle-aged man who unsuccessfully attempted to preserve a 400-year-old oak tree not too far from where we are in Southern California. And just 2 months ago, young activists sat in high trees in North Texas to try to halt construction of the Keystone XL pipeline. And the last of the activists who were arrested during that protest were just released from prison this week. I'm thinking that these activists probably had no idea that the biblical writings would be of any help, inspiration, or comfort. And the truth is, most of our churches wouldn't either. Most of our churches would probably dismiss such actions as wrong-headed or idealistic. But I hope that I've made the argument tonight that these modern tree sitters sit squarely in the prophetic tradition, just as did the forest martyrs I mentioned at the beginning of this talk. And they did not die in vain. Today in the Philippines, There is a special award given each year in honor of Father Satur by the Earth Savers movement to those who defend the environment. Chico Mendes became internationally famous for his work, bringing the plight of the rainforest to worldwide attention. And just 1 week after Sister Dorothy was gunned down, Luiz da Silva, the president of Brazil, responded to massive international outcry by ordering the creation of 2 Amazonian rainforest reserves. On the 5th anniversary of Sister Dorothy's martyrdom, we held an institute in California on the Bible and forest justice that was co-sponsored by Sister Dorothy's order, the Sisters of Notre Dame de Namur. One elderly nun who had lived with Dorothy for many years, Sister Judy Clemens, pictured here, shared riveting stories of working with the fiery Dorothy Stang. Dorothy's brother, a retired priest, talked about his efforts to make sure that the wealthy ranchers who contracted for Sister Dorothy's murder would be held accountable in Brazilian courts. Of course, it's a continuing struggle in Brazil. And I just want to point out 2 images here on your screen. On the right is a found art portrait that was made by our artist in residence of that institute, whose name is Meg Lemur. And if you look in the bottom right hand of your screen, you can see her poster. And if you look closely, you see this storyteller who's in the trunk of the tree with its branches extending upwards and the roots downwards, and holding children in the traditional Native American storyteller doll idea. And on each side you have chariots attacking the Cedars of Lebanon and American tanks attacking oil wells. It's just a beautiful image that this wonderful artist based in Camden, New Jersey did for us. Actually, Meg, sorry, you're from Philadelphia. So these issues continue to be with us. This year in May, on May 19th, this land activist, Nilceline Miguel de Lima, left her community in La Brea, Brazil, in the South Amazonas state, fearing that she would be killed by illegal loggers. So as you can see, the same kinds of issues persist even 7 years after Dorothy's martyrdom. This particular activist has been under threat many, many times. She was given government protection for a while, but then the protection was withdrawn. She is the head of an organization called Deus Provera, God Will Provide, which is an association of local farmers and rubber tappers. In June 2010, she was beaten by loggers. Her house burned down in retaliation for her work. But she's still there, she's still organizing, and we need to keep people like this, like the tree sitters in North Texas, in our prayers. To conclude my comments, and then we'll have some time for discussion, the hopeful sign is that more and more people of different kinds of faith have begun to try to act to preserve the earth as an expression of good stewardship and good theology. Environmentalism is one of the fastest growing areas of social concern, particularly among our churches today, even among evangelicals. There's a very long tradition of green Christianity, and I love this image of the cross as the tree of life, which dates back to the Byzantine era. This long tradition is one that we need to recover, and I'm going to put up here, but I'm also going to leave it up in the notes section for those of you who want to access some of these websites. It'll be up in the notes section of a number of different websites just within the Christian tradition that are trying to seriously work on ecological justice and habitat restoration and green theology. So what I'd like to do is open it up a little bit and ask you the question, what kinds of things are you doing in your watersheds? And Tim, if you get ready to put some people on here, we're going to try to experiment with a couple of respondents, and we'll see if the audio and video will work. If it doesn't, we'll ask the rest of you to chat some of your questions and comments. But the question really on the table is, what are you doing in your watershed to engage issues of sustainability? Let me, as a way of priming the pump, let me just name a few of the things that we are trying to track here in our bioregion. We are strong supporters of the Los Padres Forest Watch, which monitors everything from microplastics in the wilderness to illegal federal oil drilling on national forest lands. We're also heavily involved in our local watershed councils, and that's something that we would encourage everybody to consider as part of your own discipleship and witness, is to locate and get to know watershed activists and forest activists. Tim Nafziger here is a staff person for Christian Peacemaker teams, and he may actually want to jump in on this during the comment time, but we are very supportive of the history of CPT's involvement with the Anishinaabe people at the Grassy Narrows community in Ontario, Canada, in their more than a decade-long nonviolent blockade of logging roads to prevent government-approved clear-cutting in violation of their treaty rights. And I would be remiss if I didn't also mention that we are supporters of those Palestinians who are trying to nonviolently stop Israeli destruction of olive groves upon which so many depend for survival. These are just some of the kinds of issues that have to do with a love of trees and justice for trees and the people who live symbiotically with trees. These issues are local, they're regional, they're international, and we can be involved wherever we are. Just one other note while you're thinking of your questions or comments. A couple of our artist colleagues have worked on turning this project on forest justice in the Bible into performances. So Tevin East, who many of you know, and I know some of you have seen her Leaps and Bounds one-woman show, has recently crafted a show entitled Blood on the Cedars, which is currently touring North America. We just had Tevin through here last month, and she gave a local performance at a local church of this show. I also want to mention Jay Beck, who has worked with Salters, also worked with Jeremy Segrist in crafting music around some of these themes. And Jay sings a beautiful rendition of Since You Were Laid Low, Nobody Comes to Cut Us Down. So those are some of the things that we're trying to embrace and keep track of. And now I want to turn it over. Tim, do we have anybody in the respondent queue live? And why don't you put your mic on and I'll turn mine off. Tim's going to see if we can get a couple of you to respond live. Meantime, if you've got comments or questions, please use the chat box. Go ahead, Tim.
So we want to bring Solveig on here. Solveig, I've enabled your microphone. If you want to go ahead and go through that process we went through earlier, you can do that. If there are other people that would like to join us by video or microphone, it's a fairly simple process that I can talk you through.
Can you hear me, Tim?
I can hear you, Solveig. Go ahead.
You can? Great. Well, I wish we could do some. I wish we could do some video here in the pub, but it's great to be here, and I'm so grateful to Chad.
If you want to try the video, we can try it.
No. It's cool. It's cool. We're on Wi-Fi here, so I think it's probably.
Okay, we're probably going to have some lags here, so once you're talking, just go ahead. Keep on going. Let's give Solvay's audio a minute to catch up and see if it comes back on here. Yeah, so while we're waiting to see if Solvay's audio kicks back on, I can talk a little bit about Grassy Narrows, the slide that Chad showed earlier. I went on a delegation there, March of 2011, and it was really powerful to hear the stories of the community there and their connection and relationship with the land. And it's a very practical relationship. They go out and go hunting and trapping in the forests around their reserve, which are their traditional lands, and they have a right to do that under treaty law. Unfortunately, the province believes that if those lands are clear cut and all the trees taken away, they can still hunt and fish as before, but that's not been their experience. And so after pursuing various legal means, as Ched mentioned, 10 years ago, they started a blockade. And logging is just one piece of the story there. There's also been mercury poisoning in the water from the paper mills that are where many of these trees end up. And so the fishing has been affected by that, and in general, the traditional ways of life have been deeply undercut, which has had impact in massive unemployment in the community, and has been very connected with alcoholism. But the resistance to the logging has been a source of Chrissy Swain, one of the blockaders, meeting her family and her daughter and seeing how their embracing of their traditional ways and the resistance to the logging had become a point of hope for them. It was really powerful. If anyone's interested in learning more about the community, the delegations are a great way to just dip in for a week or two to hear the stories from Grassy Narrows. Those delegations happen a number of times a year. You can check the CPT website for more details, and we'd love to have you. It's a great opportunity to make the connections between colonization and issues of systemic racism, as well as impact on the environment. So Solveig, we heard you briefly. Unfortunately, it just dipped in there. Okay. So we seem to have lost Solveig, unfortunately. Is there anyone else who... Yeah, so if there's anyone else, Dave Pritchett, if you had any interest in making connection with some of the work your community has done or some of your experience with Christian Peacemaker teams, that'd be welcome. Others?
Meantime, Hetty has pointed out in the chat box that there have been many crews who have gone over to help plant and replant thousands of olive trees in Palestine, and she makes the case for fair trade olive oil from Zaytun, or one of the other fair trade exporters of Palestinian olive oil. That's a really important consumer strategy, and Zaytun olive oil would make great Christmas presents as well, and by buying that product you're helping to preserve olive culture and olive trees in Palestine. So thank you, Hetty, that's a great suggestion.
While we're waiting for the questions, one thing I'd say particularly about Grassy Narrows that I think Ched alluded to is the way their struggle is not about an abstract environmentalism. It's about a specific relationship with their treaty area and their traditional lands, and that means that sometimes it flows and goes in different ways than a more abstract environmentalism does. But obviously there's also strong connections as well. They've had allies with the Rainforest Action Network at various times.
The Elkhart crew, if there's anybody there that wants to get in a question, we'd love to hear from you. Joanna, you're uncharacteristically quiet.
So Jennifer, you ask about where does one get fair trade olive oil? I'll copy the link in here again. It's called Zatoun. That's ZATOUN.com. So I'll just read some of what people are commenting here, starting with Dave Pritchett. One of the beautiful things I saw in the Negev, Dave says, on a Christian Peacemaker Team's delegation was the resilience of olive trees, which have been bulldozed by the Jewish National Fund, with roots intact. We're sending up new shoots, becoming signs of hope to the Bedouin villagers whose houses had also been bulldozed by Israelis. Thanks, Dave. And we have Jason currently milling acorns while listening to the webinar, and yarrow beer harvested from the watershed. And Jim Ball says, Joan, a native New Zealander, remembers the legacy of the clear-cutting of kauri trees, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, for homes and larger construction, trees that take more than 100 years to mature. While much reforestation has happened and preserves created, the legacy of fallen trees and too many barren hills remain. We must go. Best to all.
Jim and company are probably already gone, but Elaine and I had the opportunity to walk through a kauri forest some years ago, about 10 years ago, in New Zealand, Aotearoa, and just amazing old growth trees. These sorts of stories are repeated on every continent and every island. So thanks for that, Jim.
Sherry writes, I'm attending a march tomorrow about mountaintop removal for coal in Appalachia. People are boycotting a bank that continues to mountaintop removal. What else can be done from Philly, since we don't live near the destroyed areas? Well, one connection that comes to mind, Sherry, I don't know if you're familiar with the center in Camden. Just the Center for Environmental Transformation. That's a organization that's doing a lot of good work in restoration. I'll try to find the link here and paste it in for you. Andrea Farrick is a...
Sherry, while Tim is doing that, there is an organization in Washington, D.C., not too far from you, called Faith and Money, which has keyed on mountaintop removal, and they've been taking people to Appalachia, and that would be a resource. I know that around all environmental issues, people are talking about not only protesting, but also economic strategies of divestment. So I think both are needed, and you might talk to Faith and Money about that. I see that Aaron and Shadi down in LA have the question of how much of modern Palestine do we think is forested. That's a good question, Shadi. I don't know the answer at this point. That could probably be Googled. I know that there's a lot of forest farming going on in Israel in particular, and farmed forests are never a replacement. A very neat and clean planting of trees is not particularly the reproduction of an older forest ecology. Wendell Berry, for those of you who are Wendell Berry fans, has written an entire book on forests, and maybe Charlita can Google that. Can't remember the title of it, but it's a whole book on sustainable forestry as a way of life, and as usual, Wendell Berry has a good approach to these questions. Back to you, Tim.
Yeah, so I pasted in the link for the Center for Environmental Transformation in Camden, which is a great organization working with native plants. Andrea Farrick is involved there. And if you look at their website, you can see some of the things that are coming up. And of course, Camden, New Jersey is the site of a lot of environmental racism with many very polluting industries that have put their plants there over the years.
So we've got about 4 or 5 more minutes, so if you've got one last burning question, chat it in, and I'm going to invite Tim, maybe you can recover the music and we'll send people out with music. I'm not sure where that box went. But if there are any last questions or comments, we got just a couple more minutes. Yeah, Solveig wants to see if we want to try her again. We'd love to try you again, Solveig.
Okay, so you're enabled, and while you're beginning here, just note that Dave is pointing out the campaign to end mountaintop removal in DC. Solveig, let's see if this works. If you also want to
Can you hear me now?
The text of the poem in the chat in case you get dropped out again, I could read it.
I'll see if I can do that. Can you hear me?
Solveig, is it working for you to turn on audio?
Yeah. I have done that. Can you hear me? I see that I am being heard by my computer at least.
Yeah.
Did you hear my voice, or did you get the poem on the chat?
Yep, we got both. Go for it. And if you drop out, I can just continue reading.
Great, I'll just read it. Dear friends, if we will have the wisdom to survive, to stand like slow-growing trees on a ruined place, renewing, enriching it, if we will make our seasons welcome here, asking not too much of earth or heaven, then a long time after we are dead, the lives our lives prepare will live there, their houses strongly placed upon the valley sides, fields and gardens, rich windows. The river will run clear as we will never know it, and over it, bird song like a canopy. On the levels of the hills will be green meadows, stock bells in noon shade. On the steeps where greed and ignorance cut down an old forest will stand, its rich leaf fall drifting on its roots. The veins of forgotten springs will have opened. Families will be singing in the fields. In their voices, they will hear a music risen out of the ground. They will take nothing from the ground, they will not return, whatever the grief at parting. Memory, native to this valley, will spread over it like a grove. And memory will grow into legend, legend into song, song into sacrament. The abundance of this place, the songs of its people and its birds, will be health and wisdom and indwelling light. This is no paradisal dream. Its hardship is its possibility.
That's gorgeous, Solveig. Thank you so much, and we're hearing you really well. So if you have any, if you want to give us any brief reflections on what you've heard tonight, as someone who's right up there at the ground zero of a lot of forest struggles, we'd love to hear a bit more for you. We're hearing you really well right now.
Oh, that's great. Well, I have a little bit more about water and about coal than about forests at the moment. The Nestle, of course, wants to build a water bottling plant at Columbia Gorge, and we're actively opposing that. And the other action that's coming up very immediately next week is the and New Zealand Coal Company wants to mine coal in Montana and Wyoming and transport it by trains to Eastern Oregon and then down the Columbia Gorge and out across the ocean to Taiwan and Japan and Korea. And of course, the environmental implications, the human and environmental implications of this are devastating. And so the hearings are coming up even just this next week. So there's a lot happening always, always in this neck of the woods. But from a faith perspective, well, that's from a faith perspective, but also in terms of, I'm so grateful for your work, Ched, because it helps ground people of faith in sources of wisdom and power that we need for this struggle, to stay with it for the rest of our lives, which is what it will be, and for generations to come. And so there's much that's happening up here in the Portland area with regard to my own fledgling community, the Wilderness Way community, which seeks to tap the resources both of Scripture and Christian theology and of nature, and say that we must ground ourselves in both if we will have the will to survive. And so putting that really at the heart of who we are, and so it is not marginalized, which is what consistently happens in so many Christian faith communities, is that there's the kind of like the green team or the environmental team, which is all good, but structurally and institutionally, it's almost consistently marginal and optional. And so that's one piece of our work here, is to say, in fact, that not only is it not optional, it's absolutely central, as you so eloquently said, that this is the central story of humanity, and it's really the central Christian story, biblical scripture story as well. So anyway, we're just seeking to ground ourselves in those deeper sources of wisdom and peace and strength to do the kind of work that we need to be about. So thanks.
Thank you, Solveig. Solveig is in Portland with the Wilderness Way community there, alternative church, and a wonderful friend. And Solveig, I think there's some collaboration in the works with some people at George Fox Seminary that we're trying to work on. So we look forward to working that more. Thank you so much for your faithful patronage of these webinars, and we look forward to improving on the technology so we can have more interaction. I do want to draw this to a close in the interest of sticking with our time parameters. And let me do that first by saying that particularly for those of you who are new to these webinars, Adam and some of the others, Jennifer Schrock, glad to have you. You will, in about a week, get a link to the archived version of this webinar, and so you will be able to show it, listen to it, and so look for that. And all of the notes and the URLs and even the music, I think, will be on the archived webinar. So you can retrieve a lot of this material because there's been lots of websites being thrown up into the chat box, and I know it's hard to try to take all that down. So that'll all be available on the archived webinar. This is, Dave, in response to the question, wanting to know a little bit more about the relationship between the critique of empire and the visions of the New Jerusalem. That, of course, is a topic for another webinar altogether, and we would hope that we would be able to do that before too long. This is, I think, our third in the series of our Ecojustice webinars, and we're in the process of putting together our lineup for 2013, and I would imagine that probably that will be one of the themes. So we'll definitely be trying to wrestle with that. We do want you to help us spread the word of these webinars. We're trying to both get a broad reach, and we're continuing to work on the interactivity. The interactivity usually suffers on the quality of the connection that you have, and so we do recommend that you cable in wherever possible, particularly if you're going to try to be a respondent. We're really happy that you all joined us, and let Khalil Gibran have the last word. The historic struggle between exploiters and defenders of the forests obviously continue everywhere, and upon this struggle, in a very real ecological sense, hinges the fate of our world. This argument tonight has been that the Bible takes very specific sides in this context on behalf of the trees. This, needless to say, has been a hidden tradition in Christendom, but the issues with which Isaiah and the prophets were so deeply concerned are all still with us. So it's time to recur and to re-embody this extraordinary biblical witness. So friends, thank you for joining us, and may we all embrace the passion intoned by the great Khalil Gibran. My love as the cedars and the elements shall not conquer it. And we're going to send you out by playing once again Jeremy Segrist, and listen for. Thanks everybody for joining us.
Strong to the light.